Welcome to the Jesus.net channel where we explore life, faith, and Jesus together. Every week, our friend Pastor Grant Fishbook hosts a live Q&A where we respond to life questions from viewers just like you. Be sure to like this video and hit that subscribe button so you get all the latest content and you know when we're going live. Now, listen as Pastor Grant responds to a few featured questions that you might be asking too. We're going to kick off with Phyllis's question, which is, I think, something we've all experienced. Phyllis says, how do I get past the hurt and pain after I've forgiven someone and they continue to bring that situation up in conversations?
Well, let me answer that. Sorry, let me respond to that with a personal story. So years ago, when my wife Laurel and I moved to Washington State, we came to another church here in the county, a different church that I'm pastoring at right now. And we came to serve underneath of a senior pastor. His name was Dave. And Dave was an incredible, incredible leader. We were minding our own business up in Manitoba in Canada. And Dave came and basically said, you can stay here in Canada and continue to serve God faithfully, or you can come to Washington State and change the world with me. And, you know, Dave just had one of those compelling ways of you just wanted to be on his team. So we moved to Washington State. We relocated our entire family. We changed countries. We changed everything. And 9 months after we got here, we found out that Dave had actually been having an extramarital affair. And it was a heartbreaking deal. I mean, we went from one moment we had a leader and a pastor and a friend, and suddenly he was gone. In the beauty of that situation, Dave and I were able to stay in touch. We stayed connected to each other. And I will never forget the day that he came and said, you know, I need you to forgive me for what I did. You know, I put your family at risk. I put your ministry at risk. I put all of these things at risk. And Grant, I need you to forgive me for what I did. And he owned it. He owned it. He said, you know, I was selfish. I was scared. I was sinning. I didn't know where to turn, what to do. And you got caught in my sinful drama and it cost you something. And I want to make it right. Well, scripture says we're supposed to forgive as the Lord forgave you. So God has forgiven me so many times. And so I wanted to pay that forward to Dave. I'm like, Dave, of course I'm going to forgive you. Like, you asked for forgiveness. I forgive you. We are brothers. We're going to stay together. What's interesting is Dave and I ended up pastoring in the same church network over time. In fact, not too long ago, Dave actually came back to the church I'm pastoring now, and he worked here as a pastor of ministries. He did a number of different things. And then tragically, and still breaks my heart to talk about it, Dave actually was diagnosed with an inoperable brain tumor, and he passed away a few years ago. There was a moment, Phyllis, when I answer your question, when Dave kept doing exactly the same thing. I'd forgiven him. We had moved on. He kept bringing it up over and over and over again. He'd talk about, you know, my sin, how it hurt you. I'm not sure how you could ever trust me again. I've given you every reason, you know, to not trust me. And he would keep bringing this up over and over and over again. I remember the moment when I looked at Dave and I said, Dave, if God can forgive and remove that from his memory, why do you keep bringing it up? And I remember he just kind of stopped and looked at me with this blank expression on his face. And I said, no, really. I said, God forgave you. I forgave you, but you keep dragging this stuff up from the past and throwing it right in front of the two of us, and we keep tripping over it. So I remember what I said, Dave, I love you, but if you ever bring this up again, you and I are going to have a problem. Like, we need to move beyond this together. So I'm going to say it again. You're forgiven. I've been forgiven by God. You've been forgiven by God. You asked for forgiveness. I was able to give it to you. Someday I'm going to have to do the same thing. I'm going to have to ask you for forgiveness. I know we're going to trip over each other, but we need to release this. There's so many times in scripture where the author of scripture is saying we need to leave this stuff behind. Now, we never forget the lessons, but we leave the pain and the injury behind, because if we don't, it settles into bitterness. Bitterness becomes resentment. Resentment just settles into the deepest pores of our soul. And before we know it, it can own us. And so we need to release those things. And the way we release them is by actually observing what God told us to do. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. God forgives fully. He forgives completely. He harbors nothing behind, and he celebrates the fact that the person came and made it right. And we need to live exactly the same way. So to my friend who wrote this question in, my response would be, you need to challenge your friend that if forgiveness has truly been asked and given, that we need to stop dragging this up from the past again, because it's actually tripping you up now. I believe they probably don't even realize they're doing it. They probably have no idea.
Hmm.
It's how beautiful to be able to say, look, you don't owe me anything. You've been forgiven. But apparently
Hmm.
you're having a hard time forgiving yourself. So I've
Yeah.
forgiven you. God's forgiven you. Now, why don't you forgive you? Let's move on. We don't need to go back to this pile of smoking embers from our past. We can actually
Hmm.
move on and experience good forgiveness together, and the unity
Yeah.
of believers. You know, the fact that Dave and I kept our friendship after all those things was beautiful. It was one of the most beautiful things that I've ever been able to participate in. There you go.
And Grant, when you were talking about that scripture, forgive as the Lord forgives you, I think we often reference that in forgiving other people, but not in
Mhm.
forgiving ourselves. And
Absolutely.
I mean, and honestly, I think it's so hard. It is so hard to forgive yourself when you've done something wrong. And I love that idea that you can forgive yourself as God has forgiven you too, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
You don't
Well,
make progress when you hold on to that.
forgiveness is releasing someone else from judgment. That's really what forgiveness is. That's the
Mm,
emancipation. Well, when you withhold that from yourself, what you're really saying is God's forgiveness is not good enough for me.
wow.
So we need to
Wow.
forgive ourselves. We need to release ourselves from that judgment so that we can live free, so that we can move in the right direction, so that we can live the life that God has for us. He doesn't want
Mm,
us to live in that place of condemnation. So sometimes we have
mm.
to call each other out of that.
Well, and while we're on forgiveness, I wanted to get to Janice's question because I think this
Okay.
speaks right to it. Janice says, I'm having difficulty with the loss of a longtime friend. I've already asked her forgiveness, but I don't know what more I can do. Grant, how do you respond when you've asked someone forgiveness and you don't feel like they'll give you that forgiveness? What do you do in that situation?
Well, that is an amazing question. And I think many of us will have run into that at some point, maybe not everybody, but when you have asked for forgiveness, that's what you can do. So that's the important part, right? That's what Jesus just said. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. And that includes ourselves. That includes, asking forgiveness. We need to be active in keeping very short accounts with other people. But if you feel like the person hasn't been able to get beyond it, that's where it becomes really, really interesting. And I think sometimes we turn it into almost a bit of a competition. Like, well, what else do I need to do? So here's the thing. You start off by consoling yourself with the fact that I did what God told me to do. I'm supposed to ask for forgiveness. If I do something wrong, I go ask for forgiveness and hope and pray that the person finds it in their heart to actually do that. If you're questioning continuously whether you need to do more, I will tell you that the only thing more you can do is to live consistently and rebuild trust with that person over a long period of time. So I will often see this in the context of marriages where someone will hurt their spouse. Then they come to their spouse and they'll say, look, I was wrong. I want to own what I did. I spoke ill of you. I didn't keep my promise. I lied to you. For that, I am deeply grieved and I want to make this right. So that's the first step. But then we have to live consistently beyond that and continue to rebuild that trust over a long time. So I had someone ask me one time, Grant, how do I rebuild trust in my marriage? And my response was, you do the right thing for a very, 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 very long time. And it rebuilds the foundation underneath of it. Now, if there's been years of things that have torn it apart, it's going to take just as many years to put the pieces back together again. So it's important for you to realize this. If you have sincerely asked for forgiveness and you are sincerely trying to live out everything that you can in order to rebuild trust, that's all that God requires of you to do. You are in charge of asking for forgiveness. You are not in charge of the other person's response. So it's important for us to understand that as well. You've done what God asked you to do, and now you need to trust that God's going to do good work in them and that they're going to find it in their own heart, in their own way, to allow you to rebuild the trust, to continue to grow together, and to hopefully bring that relationship back into a place of health. Now, I also going to say this. Sometimes that relationship will never come back exactly the way that it was before. It's just the reality of the human experience. But knowing you've done exactly what God has asked you to do is the most important thing. That's what allows you to be able to sleep well at night, knowing you followed his plan. There you go.
Yeah. Well, and you reminded me of a book, Grant, when you're talking about the process of that, called Long Obedience in One Direction, right? That you over and over again choose to act in obedience to what God has asked of you, and ultimately believe. One of the cool things is just believing and knowing and trusting that God does and can restore relationships.
Absolutely.
And he does, and he has so many times. And you and I have both seen it in our own lives, Grant. So man, just know that have hope, that if you are being faithful, you can't control how the other person responds, but God speaks to people's hearts.
He does.
And man, God, God can change hearts. So
and what a beautiful prayer to say, God, I want this person to know how sincerely I want to rebuild this relationship. So God, give me opportunities to show them the true nature of my heart and allow them to have a soft heart towards me. That's all that you can do.
Yeah.
As far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. You've done everything you can to live at peace, and then you need to release it.
Well, and Grant, as we kind of wrap up this piece on forgiveness, Monique actually asked a question about this, and she's here.
Okay,
and
great.
I've heard you kind of reference this, but I want to ask. Monique says, if you forgive someone, is it important to reach out to them and tell them that you've forgiven them, or do you just forgive and keep pressing forward?
Well, I would always, I would use so we do 12 steps of spiritual journey here at Christ the King Church a lot. And there's this beautiful phrase that says, I'm going to seek amends, forgiveness, and that as long as it doesn't do damage to the other person. And so I think we need to look at that from the perspective of being protective of the other person. And so if we have the opportunity if they have asked for forgiveness, I think it's very important for us to respond. It's very important for us to respond, to come back to them and say, yes, I absolutely forgive you. If there is a moment inside of your own heart where you have felt wronged, this has happened to me before, where I've had people come up to me and say, Grant, you didn't even know that I was angry at you, but I want you to know this happened and I forgive you. Well, that puts me in a no-win situation. I can't do anything with that, right? Because I didn't even know there was an offense. What should have happened is they should have come to me and said, Grant, you actually hurt and offended me. And if it was valid and true, it would have given me an opportunity to say, I'm so sorry that happened. Please forgive me for the wounding that I caused. So there's no win when we come, when I call it no strings attached forgiveness. That's not helpful whatsoever. So if someone has requested forgiveness of you, I believe you're duty bound. It may take time, but you're duty bound to follow the wisdom and the commandment of Jesus to also forgive. I mean, who are we to withhold forgiveness when we have been forgiven by Jesus? And then as well, if God is just doing that work inside of your heart, someone wounded you and you can just forgive them, then do exactly that. Just forgive them, release it, open up your hands. If there's ever an opportunity, maybe they'll come to you someday and say, did something happen between us? Then you can clear the air. God lives in truth and light, and we need to live in truth and in light. Because when we bring things out into the light, God blesses it, and it's amazing how he can heal relationships.
Well, and Grant, when you let someone know you've forgiven them, what I found is it frees you too. There's a part of you until you really release that. Sometimes when I don't want to tell someone I've forgiven them, it's because I haven't forgiven them yet.
Exactly.
I mean,
right.
sometimes there's still somewhere down in there. There's some part of me that doesn't, and that's a wrestling you have to do with the Lord and with that person. But man, it's so good to clear.
Yeah, words are powerful, and when we say those words, I forgive you. God moves in the truth of that statement. He moves in the light of that statement. It touches them and releases them. And you're exactly right. It frees us up to a place where we can go, okay, I'm released from this as well. Now we can be in relationship with each other. And that's beautiful.
Well, hey everyone, and thanks again for watching. For more questions like this and other content from Jesus.net, be sure to hit that subscribe button below. You can also subscribe to daily encouragement emails at miracle.jesus.net. We'd love to see you again soon on another episode of Ask Grant Live.